Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session from the Ubuntu Symposium, the last day of parallel sessions before our closing ceremony next Tuesday. Exciting. So today's session is called Violence Against Women, Lifelong Consequences, and we're going to have two different perspectives on violence against women from very different angles and regional contexts. So hopefully it will be an interesting discussion. Please also do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and if you'd like to post about the session today, the hashtag is hashtag Ubuntu Symposium or hashtag Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. So yeah, please follow us on Facebook and get involved. So throughout the session, please feel free to write any questions, comments in the chat box. We're going to have two presentations and then we're going to have some time for questions as well at the end. So please feel free to get involved. That's it for me. I'm going to pass you over now to Charles. Over to you.
Alors, le titre de ma présentation, c'est « Le pouvoir indéfectible des leaders traditionnels malagasy ». Vous voyez la traduction en bas. Alors, pourquoi ai-je choisi ce titre « Le pouvoir indéfectible des leaders traditionnels malagasy ». Tout simplement parce que à Madagascar, les leaders traditionnels possèdent des pouvoirs et qui sont très graves parce que ils ont tous les pouvoirs et privilèges et on ne sait pas comment est-ce qu'on peut faire pour, disons, donner moins de pouvoir à ces leaders traditionnels. Vous allez le voir lorsque je présenterai là, tout à l'heure les slides que je vais vous donner ici. Mais avant, il faut que je vous dise que quand on parle de pouvoir des leaders traditionnels, il y a deux mots qui sont toujours d'actualité, c'est le mot pouvoir et autorité. Je ne vais pas expliquer ce que ça veut dire le pouvoir et autorité, mais je tiens seulement à présenter que il y a le mot « je peux ». Ça vient de pouvoir. Mais je ne suis pas autorisé à faire quelque chose. Je peux, mais je ne suis pas autorisé. Mais il y a aussi, deuxièmement, je suis autorisé à faire quelque chose car j'ai le pouvoir d'utiliser mon autorité. Voilà donc le problème qui se pose pour ce thème de pouvoir indéfectible des leaders traditionnels à Madagascar. Alors voici le plan que nous allons suivre. Je vais d'abord présenter disons, la mentalité malagasy. Voilà. Comprendre la mentalité malagasy. Je vais parler de la culture malagasy. Et cette culture, je ne vais pas entrer dans les détails de la sociologie ou de l'anthropologie, mais je vais seulement vous présenter quelques, disons, vocables. Quelques vocables qui entrent dans l'explication de la mentalité malagasy, de la culture malagasy. Premièrement, il y a le mot, c'est écrit dans le mail. D'abord, pour comprendre la mentalité malgache, donc, il faut savoir que la vie, la vérité et l'équité sont des mots qu'on ne doit pas écarter. Pourquoi? Parce que le malagasy a une certaine façon de voir la vie. C'est un homme, c'est un être éminemment social. Et cet être éminemment social respecte la vie, respecte la vérité, respecte l'équité. Et vous allez voir que ces mots, avec la justice ou la vérité, tous ces mots expriment une idée qui montre la mentalité des Malagasy. Je vais d'abord expliquer ce que c'est que la vie pour les Malagasy. Respecter la vie, parce que la vie, pour les Malagasy, c'est un don de Dieu, un don des ancêtres. On va parler des ancêtres tout à l'heure. Et si on parle de la vie, nous voyons dans la pensée malagasy cette affection qu'apportent les parents à leurs enfants. Il y a ce qu'on appelle d'abord le mot morceau de ma vie, c'est la kenyenne, ou essence de ma vie, ce qui veut dire que les Malgaches portent beaucoup dans leur cœur les enfants. Et c'est cette affection qui montre que les Malgaches respectent la vie. Deuxièmement, je vais parler tout de suite de la vérité. Je vais très vite parce que je n'ai que quelques minutes. Quand on parle de vérité, c'est là que les choses ne se ressemblent pas. Parce que pour le Malagasy, quand on parle de vérité, l'homme est un mélange de défauts et de qualités. Quand l'homme est un mélange de défauts et de qualités, ce qui veut dire que l'homme juste pour le Malagasy, c'est pas celui que les Occidentaux portent dans leur vie, mais c'est autre chose. Pour le Malagasy, l'homme juste veut dire un homme qui garde l'équilibre entre le bien et le mal. Il sait équilibrer les choses entre le bien et le mal. Pourquoi? Parce que le Malagasy est un mélange de défauts et de qualité. L'homme est un mélange de défauts et de qualité pour les Malagasy. Il y a une façon de dire, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'est pas mouillé et qu'il n'est pas sec. C'est entre les deux. Donc, l'homme juste, c'est celui qui garde l'équilibre entre le bien et le mal. Mais pour les Occidentaux, l'homme juste, c'est celui qui agit conforme à la loi morale. Alors là, c'est pas pareil. Et c'est de là que vient le respect de l'équité. Parce que pour le Malagasy, la justice cherche la légitimité, mais pas la légalité comme le font les Occidentaux. Pour les Occidentaux, un homme juste, c'est celui qui agit conforme à la loi morale. Mais pour les Malagasy, même si vous agissez dans la légalité, et si vous n'avez pas la légitimité, vous n'êtes pas juste. Voilà, concernant la vérité et l'équité. Troisième ou quatrième mot, c'est le fana. Troisième mot, donc, le fana. Le fana, c'est quelque chose qui est d'une faculté de se remettre en question. Et dans ce fana, il existe un degré d'évolution selon l'âge. Je vous donne un exemple. Un enfant n'a pas d'âme ou de fana. Un enfant, c'est ce qui fait qu'il peut mourir n'importe quand. Lorsqu'il a un an à, disons, 10 ou 11 ans, il a le fana de la peur, c'est-à-dire l'âme de la peur. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il a peur d'être grondé. L'adolescent, si l'adolescent possède ce qu'on appelle le fana, c'est le fana de la honte des autres. Pourquoi? Parce que l'adolescent a honte des transformations physiques de son corps. Donc, il a honte de son corps. On voit toujours l'évolution de l'homme. Si un adulte agit, c'est parce qu'il a le fana de la honte de soi. Il agit parce que c'est sa conscience même qui entre en jeu. Il agit de par sa conscience. Et enfin, on a la sagesse lorsqu'on est vieux. Et lorsqu'on est vieux, on a le fana de la sagesse. Et c'est là que le malgache arrive à chercher, c'est parce qu'il veut devenir razan. Donc, si le vieux possède le fana de la sagesse, il peut mourir en toute quiétude parce qu'il a le fana de la sagesse. Il a un nouveau rôle dans la communauté. Voilà donc pour le fana. La valeur d'un homme, donc, hein, se trouve par son aptitude, comme il est écrit dans le slide, et son ouverture à l'inquiétude. C'est le mot asne, en dernier, que je vais expliquer, c'est une vertu, une force surnaturelle qui met l'homme à la place qu'il faut et qui l'aide à effectuer des responsabilités et des devoirs selon les normes sociales. Et celui qui agit, qui possède le asne, peut donc assurer ses actions dans la société. On va maintenant parler des leaders traditionnels. Qui sont ces leaders? Ils sont de deux catégories. Ils sont à mettre dans deux catégories. Il y a d'abord le chef de clan, c'est-à-dire, il y a beaucoup de mots qui donnent la définition de chef de clan. Il y a Tangalamena, Ajumanga, bon, le reste, j'en passe. Alors, ces chefs de clan, ce sont les représentants visibles des ancêtres. Leur tâche, c'est l'application des lois ancestrales parce qu'ils ont le pouvoir religieux dans leur clan ou dans leur ethnie ou dans leur lignée. C'est ça, leur pouvoir religieux. Ils appliquent les lois ancestrales. Deuxième catégorie de leaders traditionnels, ce sont les wumbias, les devins, les astrologues, donc les spécialistes des oracles. Leur tâche, c'est, il y a de sorte, l'éducation des membres. Ils sont gardiens de la tradition. Ils savent invoquer les rites. Ils possèdent des pouvoirs dans les invocations rituelles. Ils maintiennent ou changent les coutumes. Et c'est là le problème parce que les coutumes dépendent donc de ces catégories de leaders traditionnels. En fait, ces leaders sont craints et respectés par tout le monde. Les membres de la société craignent et respectent. Et même les autorités officielles du pays les appellent les Rayamandjin, littéralement père et mère. Et comme vous le savez, les pères et les mères possèdent des autorités, hein, une autorité qui renforce la domination de la famille, par exemple, ou des membres de la société. Tout le monde, donc, possède une confiance aveugle, une confiance aveugle envers ses leaders. Ce qui veut dire que il y a des problèmes de communication avec ces leaders parce qu'ils ont leur autorité. Troisièmement, le problème de hiérarchie et de parole, parce que il y a deux sortes de problèmes qui se posent pour les leaders traditionnels, pas pour les leaders, mais pour les membres de la société, à propos des pouvoirs de ces leaders. Premièrement, la hiérarchie. Qu'est-ce qui se passe dans la hiérarchie? Au sommet de la société se trouve Zanahar, Dieu. Puis, après Dieu, vient les Razan, les ancêtres. Vient après les Razan, les vivants. Et les vivants, c'est selon leur degré d'âge. Il ne faut pas oublier l'aïeul, c'est-à-dire celui qui est vivant, qui est représentant des ancêtres. Quand on parle de famille nucléaire, il y a le père, la mère, parmi les vivants, le père, la mère, c'est-à-dire les Rai Amandine, ce qu'on a vu auparavant, le père et mère, puis l'aîné et le cadet. C'est ce système qui est transposé dans la vie sociale de la société, donc à Madagascar. Et qu'est-ce qui se passe? Ces leaders possèdent le asthme. Il existe une relation permanente entre les ancêtres et les représentants de ces ancêtres, l'aïeul, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure. Ces ancêtres possèdent le asthme. Et comme vous le savez, on ne peut pas avoir de communication car les idées des leaders ne doivent pas être critiquées parce que leur parole est sacrée. Vous savez que les jeunes possèdent plus de compétences de par la technologie moderne. Ils veulent prendre leurs responsabilités et aspirer au progrès. Et c'est là que la communication ne passe pas parce que les leaders traditionnels ne peuvent pas être critiqués. La parole, deuxièmement, la parole. Problème de parole. Comme vous le savez, la parole, c'est sacré. Il y a la valeur de la parole dans les pratiques rituelles. Je ne parle pas des leaders religieux, parce que ça, tout le monde le connaît, la valeur sacrée de la parole dans les croyances. Je vais parler de la bénédiction ou de la conjuration concernant ce problème de parole. Parce que les paroles peuvent changer le cours de la vie des membres de la société. Pour les Malagasy, il y a deux mots très importants qu'il faut mettre en jeu, qui entrent en jeu. Le tsini, c'est-à-dire le blâme ou le reproche, et le tudi, ou le fatal retour.
Sorry to interrupt, Charles. We can hear two of the interpreters speaking at the same time at the moment. I'm not sure what's going on there, but maybe you can fix the issue. Sorry to interrupt, Charles. Please continue.
I can continue.
Yes, please.
OK. Alors, je continue. J'ai parlé tout à l'heure de la valeur des paroles. Il y a deux mots, le tsini et le tudi, c'est-à-dire le blâme, le reproche, et le tudi, fatal retour des choses. Et quand ces deux vocables entrent en jeu dans la vie des Malagasy, il faut faire attention, parce que le tsini, le blâme et le reproche, peut être évité, tandis que le tudi, le fatal retour des choses, peut se racheter et peut même atteindre la progéniture de celui qui agit contre l'intérêt de tout le monde. Et c'est ça le problème. Donc, la parole a une valeur à ne pas négliger. Et dans la langue malagasy, la parole est sacrée. Parce que la langue malagasy, c'est une tradition orale. C'était seulement au IXe siècle que les Arabes ont apporté la première écriture malagasy dans le sud-est de l'île. C'est ce qu'on appelle le sourabé. Mais je ne veux pas en parler. Les leaders traditionnels maîtrisent alors à merveille cet instrument du pouvoir. Je parle de la parole. Une citation de Louis Mollet, un historien, qui dit « Celui qui parle est doté de asthme et est à même de modifier la situation des autres. » Vous voyez par là le pouvoir de ces leaders traditionnels qui arrivent à modifier la situation. Voilà donc le problème qui arrive quand on parle de ces leaders traditionnels. Et voici 4 questions que j'ai établies. J'ai élaboré ces 4 questions pour que nous puissions discuter si vous voulez bien. Je vais seulement les lire et vous allez comprendre de quoi est-ce qu'il s'agit. Première question. Comment faire pour réformer ou au moins alléger le pouvoir des leaders traditionnels afin qu'on puisse avoir confiance en eux et les respecter comme il se doit? Et c'est le problème parce que ils ont toute la confiance de la population. Deuxième question, comment atténuer l'impact de ces paramètres intrinsèques du patriarcat, c'est-à-dire la hiérarchie et la parole, dans les valeurs culturelles malagasy même? Troisième question, et je crois que c'est le plus important, que faire pour que ces leaders traditionnels puissent transmettre aux jeunes des réflexes moraux et sociaux permettant d'assurer la paix et l'harmonie au sein d'une communauté. La quatrième question, ce n'est pas une question, mais une réflexion qui de la responsabilité des leaders dont l'intellect et le moral ne suivent pas le développement de la civilisation moderne, parce que nous savons que ces leaders traditionnels sortent du fin fond de la brousse. Ils n'ont pas reçu quelque chose de la civilisation moderne, donc ils ont besoin de beaucoup de choses. Comment faire alors pour les responsabiliser? Voilà mon exposé, mais je tiens seulement à vous dire que Madagascar a prévu déjà des sensibilisations pour aborder ce thème de pouvoir indéfectible des leaders religieux. On a prévu des séances, des réunions de sensibilisation qui parlent des initiatives à faire pour atteindre l'égalité entre hommes et femmes. Est-ce que ces leaders peuvent vraiment être des acteurs de changement? On va leur demander donc qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent de ces pratiques qu'ils ont, de ces pouvoirs qu'ils ont. On va parler des initiatives qui sont bénéfiques pour marcher ou converger vers l'égalité dans la communauté. On va aussi leur demander c'est quoi pour eux le bien-être, ce qu'ils appellent le bien-être. Est-ce que ça concerne l'eau potable? Est-ce que ça concerne la santé, le logement, l'éducation et tout? On va leur demander aussi comment est-ce qu'ils voient ce qu'on appelle la violence fondée sur le sexe. Comment est-ce qu'ils estiment les relations entre partenaires intimes? Est-ce que le changement, pour eux, est important quand on parle de communication? Est-ce que ces leaders agissent en tant que spectateurs actifs devant les problèmes de la communauté? C'est toutes ces questions que je voudrais qu'on discute, si vous voulez bien. Merci de votre attention. J'ai terminé ma présentation.
Thank you, Shah, very much. Thank you. So I'm going to pass back over now to Alessandra now, or did you want to take questions first just on this presentation?
Oui, je suis prêt à répondre.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. It's sort of interesting to hear about sort of the different cultural boundaries and the reflections and questions that you were posing. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the initiatives that you're trying, what kind of activities you or your organization is doing to try and address this situation.
Oui, merci Alessandra pour cette question. Alors, comme je vous l'ai dit, c'est un problème épineux pour nous et on a besoin d'aide pour avoir des initiatives dans le but d'atteindre donc l'égalité entre hommes et femmes. Vous voulez savoir sur quel thème, sur quelle partie au juste? Vous voulez que j'intervienne sur quelle partie de ce que j'ai expliqué tout à l'heure?
I don't know what kind of activities your organization does, so maybe also in general, what kind of activities you are promoting and what seem the most promising practices.
D'accord, ok, je comprends maintenant. Alors, nous avons, parce que c'est un problème que nous, Madagascar, nous abordons dans 3 régions de l'île. Premièrement, nous avons sensibilisé les leaders traditionnels sur des questions. Je vous ai donné quelques questions tout à l'heure, mais le plus important, c'est de leur demander comment il voit le problème des normes patriarcales, par exemple, le problème de mariage précoce, comment on peut améliorer leur pouvoir, si on peut améliorer leur pouvoir. Et comment les leaders voient le problème des droits des femmes. Comment est-ce qu'ils voient les violences basées sur le genre? Ce sont les questions que nous avons demandées à ces leaders traditionnels dans nos actions. Il y avait des réunions, des sensibilisations que nous avons faites, mais ils étaient très peu à répondre à l'invitation parce que, je ne sais pas, c'est ça le problème. Je ne sais pas si vous avez quelques initiatives à nous proposer pour réunir ces leaders traditionnels. C'est ça le problème pour nous.
The only similar experience I can think of is that of training judges. They are sort of like very much how you describe this group of with a lot of power and a lot of self-referral in terms of ideas and norms. And so I think what we think is necessary is to engage some of the leaders themselves, the judges themselves that may have more progressive views or a positive understanding of gender equality, and enlist them to go to other group leaders, because it seems like there are certain groups of leaders that have to be kind of engaged by people that they perceive as equal in sort of their status.
Oui, merci bien. J'ai oublié de dire tout à l'heure que nous avons aussi sensibilisé les forces de l'ordre, les policiers. Nous avons parlé avec les autorités locales. Nous avons aussi parlé avec les membres de la société civile. On a aussi parlé avec presque tous les membres de la société qui ont des avantages à prendre dans les relations avec ces leaders traditionnels. Et dans toutes ces actions, ce que vous avez dit tout à l'heure, on a essayé de voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire. Alors, tout le monde s'active pour aider à nous trouver des idées pour que ces leaders aient des changements dans leur position. C'est ça le problème, donc, que j'ai voulu apporter tout à l'heure. Je ne sais pas si ça pourrait vous éclaircir les idées. Le problème, donc, c'est comment faire pour faire face aux problèmes et aux pratiques néfastes de la société par ces leaders traditionnels. Voilà le grand problème. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons besoin de vos aides.
Great, thank you, Charles. Anyone else have any other questions or comments on what's been presented? If not, we can maybe do another round of questions at the end when we've heard both presentations. Yeah, so if there's no other comments or questions, maybe Alessandra, you'd like to move ahead?
Okay.
D'accord.
Okay, so I will be doing the presentation. I'm Alessandra Pauncz. I'm the Executive Director of the European Network of the Work with Perpetrators. I am here presenting with Sandra Jovanovic that is going to be working with training and capacity building at WWP. And she's going to begin with the presentation. The topic that we're going to be addressing today is rather specific because it's a project that we've been working on that addresses elderly abuse and intimate partner violence. So I hope that this will be of interest, and we will give you a little bit of context, and then we will proceed to just sort of give you some ideas of what's being developed in the project. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'll just share the presentation. Just let me know if it's on screen, if you can see it. Hello everyone from my side as well. As Alessandra mentioned, I'm Sandra Jovanovic Belotić. I'm training and capacity building manager at WWP. We will be talking, I'm happy that we will be involved in this session, talking about violence against women and lifelong consequences as professionals who have, I think, a lifelong commitment to tackle the issue of gender-based violence and violence against women. This is something that we will cover through one specific angle of why is it important to pay specific attention on the victims of abuse who are elderly, and also on how to work with perpetrators of domestic violence as those who really commit, who are doing harm. We represent the organization European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence. We're based in Europe, in Germany. Because we have really limited time, we prepared one short video that will give you a first idea of the organization and what are we doing. So I will just play the video and briefly comment after it. Now. So this is really briefly about WWP, the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence. You might have seen that we are membership organizations, so we have more than 60 members in more than 30 European countries, perpetrator programs, but also victim support services, research institutions, and different organizations that work in the field of domestic violence. Why are we doing this? I believe that the world statistic is quite similar, but when we talk about Europe and the region that we work in, the statistic is that 1 in 3 women has experienced domestic violence. So this is really a frequent and overspread phenomenon of domestic violence. But if we look at the specific categories of the victims and pay attention on elderly victims of domestic violence, we see that elderly women are much more in risk to be victims of domestic violence. This is example of some of statistics, data about how if you are elderly and over 60s, that it's much more likely that you experience abuse than if you are younger. And also the probability that you will ask for help and try to leave a partner if you are elderly women who is experiencing violence is also decreasing. Also, elderly victims are significantly more likely to have a disability than those who are aged 60 or under. And why is this important? Because we know that disability is one of the factors that's also risky and also another vulnerability of being exposed to domestic violence. So this is the reason why we'll be focusing on this particular group of victims of violence who are elderly, and also talking about the elderly perpetrators of domestic violence as a category that's really underreported, and there are not much services that are adjusted, and you will understand by the end of the presentation what are the links that are missing in the response to domestic violence in this target group. When we talk about elderly victims of domestic violence, there are a lot of complicated issues and a lot of things that make it much more sensitive when approaching it, both from the side of working with victims and supporting victims, but also from the side of the perpetrator work. In the previous presentation, there was a lot of talk about the power and how power is important, and we know that violence is really closely linked to power. And if we talk about gender-based violence, that it's also related to power and gender inequality. In the situations when we grow old, we really see the decrease of power in several levels. When you look at the health, we are not so powerful as we used to be. Our body is not the same. We have health issues and difficulties that affect both women and men, and potential victims and perpetrators of domestic violence that can be complicated. I started to talk about different perpetrators of violence, definitely. Also finances, not being able to work anymore, dependence of certain people or certain services. That's also something that's really important. And sometimes it's also a factor why victims can't leave their abusers, perpetrators, either because they are dependent of them or they are taking care of them. Previous history of gender-based violence or domestic violence is something that's also really relevant. Sometimes we see the situations when we have long years of history of domestic violence in this kind of partnerships. What's really important here, we know that there's a risk of transgenerational transmission of violence, and those children who grow up in families with violence can become perpetrators. And sometimes we see that they're also violent toward their parents, mothers, and that this is something that's also an issue. There are multiple potential perpetrators and relations with them. In this target group, we really see that perpetrators can be partners, but also sons, daughters, people who are taking care of them. So Alessandra will mention it in more detail, but this is something that's really complicating the situation. And somehow elderly victims of abuse, they fall into this gap of being both victims of intimate partner violence, but also elderly abuse and neglect. And this means that the needs need to be addressed in several levels, and that these victims really need support from many institutions and organizations at the same time. Usually these should be also healthcare institutions, but also some victim support services, and we will talk about perpetrator programs. What was found as the situation in the practice is that professionals and organizations really lack capacity to provide this needed support. They don't have skills on how to identify victims of violence, and if they identify, how to provide services that really match their needs. So this was one of the reasons why the project that WWP is currently involved in, MARVO, was developed. It's abbreviation from Multi-Agency Response to Violence Against Older Women. And the main thing that the MARVO will develop and is currently developing, it's an ongoing project, is multi-agency cooperation model to work with victims and perpetrators of violence against older women. It has one component that will improve knowledge of all the stakeholders in prevention and response to domestic violence, so to build their capacities, but also to develop a model how they will all work together and how they will all adjust the services that they're already providing to this specific target group. One specific model of case conferencing for older victims of violence is developed and currently tested in 3 countries, in Austria, in Greece, and in Estonia. And this model will be evaluated and then designed in a way that it can be disseminated and distributed Europe-wide or worldwide. Project Marvo is built on previous experiences of the project working with healthcare organizations to support elderly victims of abuse, and it's building up on that because it was understood that identification of victims of domestic violence is not enough, and that we need to do more, and that we need to do more to protect victims. So, of course, when we talk about this phenomenon and this problem of gender-based violence, especially in this category, the protection of victims is something that's essential. And one huge part of how to keep victims safe is how to work in a responsible and accountable way with those who do harm and who perpetrate violence, and how to make it part of the wider community response to domestic violence, because we know that this is the only thing that gives results. Just short introduction into the perpetrator programs and why is it relevant, and what's the purpose of these programs. So programs for perpetrators of domestic violence have a goal to support and protect victims, but through another angle, by working with those who perpetrate violence. And they have 2 main lines of work. One of them is to assess and manage risk of the repetition of violence and to make victims safer in that way, but also to support the perpetrators in their process of change, because we also know that this is important, and if we don't do it, then we have the repetition of violence. And when we talk about violent behavior and what we can do about it, I really like to present it through this iceberg metaphor. What we usually see on the surface is this iceberg and the violent behavior, and we can try to remove it or to have like the huge boat that will try to move it or destroy it by some kind of repressive measures or some other kinds of activities. But the truth is that we really need to work on what's under the surface and what's causing the violent behavior. And there are multiple layers, but gender inequality, gender role beliefs, what it means to be a man in different communities, the way that we think about this, health issues. So all these things that are really the cause of violence, we need to dive in and to work on them. And this is the added value of perpetrator programs, because this is what perpetrator programs do. If we have elderly victims of violence and perpetrators of violence, then we really need to have a specific approach on how to do it. And I will pass it to Alessandra so she can guide you through these specifics of the work.
Thank you, Sandra. So moving forward, some questions that we tried to pose during the course of this project is, how do we include, how do the responses change if we include perpetrators in the equation of intervention? So for quite a long time, in the first project that you saw, the WOSEFA, the focus was on providing assistance to elderly women, and the perpetrator was not really included in the assessment or the idea that we could intervene on him as well. And this had created many critical aspects, because some of the very immediate issues that we face when dealing with elderly abuse, and in this case we're talking about intimate partner violence. So first of all, there's a stereotype and an idea that violence is strong and present only in younger couples. However, what we've learned is that there are many couples in which the violence just continues for the course of the whole life. It doesn't, it might not be the most severe violence, but there is sort of ongoing violence for the whole life. But sometimes, because maybe both the perpetrator and the victim work outside of the house some of the time, there is some kind of a balance in which the situation is acceptable, and that can completely change when, for example, one of the two or both of them retire. In these cases, even if we're working with the victim, first of all, we're dealing with long-term effects of violence. So many of these victims have been victims of violence for 30 or 40 years. And so the effects of violence at this point are very, very, very long-standing. There may be rather alienated relationship with the children, because the adult children at this point have assisted violence for a very long time and can't really be a support in these situations. The kind of solutions that can be found are often need to be permanent solutions, and it's very, very, very hard for elderly people to leave their home. So in many situations, it's almost impossible to find a support and solution for some of these women. So the question about how can we also intervene with the perpetrators? Can we change the response to these situations if we include perpetrators in the equation of the intervention? At the same time, we obviously have to account and we have to maintain victim safety and hold the perpetrators accountable. And how can we do that in these situations? And also, how do we provide for questions, but also procedures and way of working for respond to different kinds of perpetrators? Because within the framework of what we were discussing before, what Sandra mentioned, we have perpetrators of domestic violence, but we also sometimes have caregivers that are violent with elderly people. We have sometimes children that are taking care of elderly people and that can be violent with elderly. So there are various levels at which this can happen, and the intervention is going to be different depending on what we're discussing. So starting from the risk factors, what are some of the risk factors in elder abuse? There is, in general, weak community sanctions against domestic violence, and this is rendered even more invisible when the victim and the perpetrator are elderly people, because it's just something that isn't sometimes taken into consideration. The fact that there are weak community sanctions, so there's a high tolerance for violence, means that maybe the victim that has, as we said, been a victim for maybe 30 or 40 years does not recognize that the violence is actually a crime. She doesn't think that maybe she's entitled to support, and doesn't even know that support is available. And on the other hand, the perpetrator thinks that he's entitled to use violence. He's used it his whole life, and nobody's going to come now and tell him what to do or how to manage his life. There are also social norms due to family privacy that make it difficult sometimes for outsiders to intervene. The victim can be ashamed of what other people think of her. She might feel guilty, think that it's her fault because she's not good enough, which is also what the perpetrator sometimes says. So this might be a compounding and additional factor that makes it harder for her to leave. The family norms around privacy and that sort of protect the violence also contribute to the sense of entitlement of the perpetrator. But also there may be aspects of shame and guilt in the perpetrator himself for being violent, and that can also have consequences in him minimizing or blaming the victim for the violence. There could be social isolation in the community, and this can be both a cause and a consequence for the violence and the abuse. And again, maybe the victim is afraid of talking because she's ashamed and afraid, and more often than not, the perpetrator doesn't recognize the violence as a problem. Lastly, but not for importance, are the community norms related to masculinity and the ideas of men having authority over women. This can contribute to the victim feeling a sense of powerlessness and that she has to comply, she doesn't have other options, and again, nurtures the entitlement of the perpetrator that whatever he does is right. So these are some of the risk factors. Some research has been done to try and categorize different kinds of perpetrators, and in this description, I'm not going to go into much detail because it's kind of interesting to see how when we are discussing perpetration in literature, it pretty much refers to caregiver perpetration. So we may talk about the overwhelmed offender, which is somebody that is a care provider, but is unable of meeting the needs of the caregiving, is overwhelmed, and sometimes does not realize that their behavior is abusive, or they may just be overwhelmed and realize that their behavior is abusive, but they have difficulty in asking help. So it's more related to the caregiving aspect. Also, there could be an offender that's impaired, so he may have physical, mental problems or suffer from abuse, substance, and so he's not actually able to take care of the elderly. This kind of offender usually tends to be neglectful, it doesn't give the medicine correctly or forgets what time things should be taken, and they typically do not realize that their behavior is abusive. And then there are different other characteristics, the narcissistic offender, which is more interested in exploiting the older person and sort of just focus on themselves and on not in what is a positive advantage for themselves. The bullying offender, in this case, they want to exert control over their victims and they have little compassion. The bullying offender may perpetrate different forms of abuse, including physical, sexual, emotional, financial, and usually the victims are frightened to report this violence. And then there's a sadistic offender, which is actually somebody that enjoys humiliating and terrifying older people. So, I mean, it's a starting point, but even as a starting point, these different categories would have to be differently declined if we're talking about a son-daughter, if we're talking about a spouse, if we're talking about a family caretaker, or if we're talking about a general caretaker. And so, I mean, one of the first evident things is when we're talking about perpetration, how much work we still need to do to really try and look at, with a gendered lens to what is happening in elderly abuse and to the different possibilities and the different ideas around perpetrators that we have. As we saw, that literature was basically looking into caretakers and family caretakers, but there's so much more that we can see. So if we want to decline the different kinds of abuse, and we want to look into different caretakers. So is a caretaker a son or a daughter? Is a caretaker a spouse? Is a caretaker a younger spouse under 65 or older spouse over 65? And if we want to look to different factors, for example, if we're looking at situations of domestic violence, we're going to have to discuss issues around gender roles and traditional male-female stereotypes. We are going to look at dynamics formed over time, and we need to target this population in a specific way. So, for example, if we're looking at the lens of gender roles and traditional male-female stereotypes, what are going to be the effects if we are looking at son-daughters that are caretakers and that are abuseful? So what have been the issues of power being expressed in this family up to that day? And how would that inform the behavior of the children and their sense of entitlement in using violence? If they've seen for their whole life violent enacted, if they've been also violated themselves. Let's go to the next slide, Sandra, if possible. How is that going to have consequences for the way in which we treat them? Because here we also start to think of how are we going to address this if we're working with these specific populations. If we're looking at a spouse under 65, with gender roles and traditional male-female stereotypes, we're going to have to be working on deconstructing stereotypes. And if we have a spouse that's over 65, we may have an additional identity challenge. Who am I? Because that definition of man is what that defines the identity and life choices of a whole lifetime. And if I'm not that anymore, then who am I? Also, if we're looking at dynamics formed over time with sons and daughters that are in this position, we're going to have the effects of trauma over time, assisted violence. So this obviously is going to inform the capacity or the treatment that we have to work on. If we have a spouse under 65, the fact that this violence has gone on for so long is going to have created a very strong sense of entitlement. With long-term effects of violence in the victims. And this then has consequences because obviously they're dealing with somebody that's going to have some serious impairments that are actually, they may have not been so on the onset of the violence, but they probably are pretty entrenched by after 30 or 40 years of violence. If we have older spouses, it might be difficult to accept the consequences of a life failure. I mean, revising your life at that point and looking at how many choices were hurtful for the ones that we supposedly love or are next to us can be extremely painful. You also may be looking at long-term damage, maybe with your children, maybe even with your spouse, that you may not be able to repair or cannot be repaired in any way. And so this again is a very depressing and grim prospect. If we are working with trying to make this violence more visible and also create accesses in which the caretakers can ask for help if they are perpetrating violence, we need to target information to this specific population in a very specific way. If we are addressing children that are violent to their parents, if we're addressing spouses or caretakers, we need to individualize, we need to address what their specific feelings might be, and we need to find a compassionate and positive way of engaging them for them to understand that they have to seek for help and that they can seek for help. Other aspects going on in terms of looking at this theme through a gendered lens, and how do we work with also the perpetrators in these situations. Behaviors are very deeply rooted. They've been going on for many, many years. And in the cases of children that are violent, they may stem out of very severely dysfunctional family relations. Again, we come back to, in the cases of spouses, the fact of the sense of entitlement has a very long history and may be very hard to change. There also may be generational belief systems and family values that for sons and daughters could get in the way of asking for support. And on the other hand, could make the man's questioning of his role extremely difficult. And there's also another important factor, which is what are the actual capacity of choices, what are the mental issues involved, what are the health issues related to mental health that are involved. So what are the actual options of change? Does degenerative illness play any part in this? Do other forms of substance abuse also play a role in that? So these are some of the questions that we should be encouraging in the coordinated interventions and in the meetings that we're having. Of course, we need to make sure that responsibility of the perpetrators is visible and not minimized and justified. But also in doing them, we have to start thinking of what this process of accountability is going to look like. Obviously basing the intervention on victim safety and perpetrator accountability. A second point, we also need to discuss some of these other issues and try to understand how they are going to be declined if we're working with an elderly population. So we have still very, very many questions around this, and little time to discuss it. So thank you for your attention. We have some resources and links on our website that I encourage you to look at, because we have national reports, newsletters, webinars, papers. We're present on social media. Our website is extremely rich, so if you're interested in this topic on perpetrator programs, this is the place to have a look at and find some of the ideas around it. Also, it's where you can be updated on the outcomes of this project. Thank you very much, and I think we can stop the sharing and come back to the workshop and answer any questions that there might be.
Thank you so much, Alessandra and Sandra, for that really interesting presentation. Does anyone have any reflections or responses on what's been presented, or any questions they'd like to ask? I'm not sure if everybody has the ability to speak, actually, but if you'd like to pose your questions in the chat box, that would be great. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can give you the ability to come on and speak.
Est-ce que je peux intervenir?
Yes, of course.
Vous m'entendez? Oui. Alors, d'accord. Pour nous, à Madagascar, je suis étonné, hein, parce que chez nous, tiens, oui, chez nous, on n'a pas l'habitude d'isoler les personnes âgées. On trouve surtout les personnes âgées dans les maisons de retraite, ce qu'on appelle hospice. Et là, je ne connais pas comment ça se passe là-bas, mais je n'ai jamais entendu parler de violence envers ces personnes âgées. Je vais même vous étonner si je vous dis que pour nous, les Malagasy, les personnes âgées, on les respecte, même s'ils ont 70, 80, 100 ans. Ils sont vieux, ils n'arrivent plus à marcher, on les met sur par exemple, une chaise et on les sort le matin, on les met sous un arbre, dans certaines régions de l'île, on les met sous un arbre, puis on leur donne à manger, puis la nuit, on les ramène à la maison pour dormir. Et c'est ainsi tous les jours. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on respecte les vieux, on les appelle des razenavelm en malagasy, en français, ce sont des ancêtres vivants. On les respecte parce qu'ils ont déjà leur asina. J'ai déjà expliqué cette vertu surnaturelle qui met l'homme à la place qu'il faut et qui l'aide à faire ses devoirs et ses responsabilités. Et cet homme ou cette femme, ces vieils hommes, vieilles femmes, qu'on emmène dehors et qu'on rentre la nuit, ben, il ou elle peut mourir en toute quiétude parce que son nouveau rôle consiste à bénir ses progénitures. Et c'est pour ça que les hommes, leurs descendants, donc, respectent. Et c'est ça que je voulais vous parler. Hein, c'est que je suis étonné qu'il y a des violences envers les personnes âgées. Merci de m'avoir écouté.
May I just briefly address this? I think that this is not something that is very visible in general. And if there is a strong incidence of domestic violence in a country, there is going to be an incidence of elderly abuse, because perpetrators that have not been treated, have not changed, do not stop hitting because their partner is old. So I think that we may be more or less aware of that, but I think that if there is domestic violence, there is domestic violence against the elderly. And if we've never heard of it, that might be because it's just not a very well-known phenomenon. That's why we think it's really important to address it. There's a question in the chat. Is there research to show if most seniors who are abused have a history of family violence? I'm curious what the statistics show, because it's clear the process we use to intervene would be different. So by history of family violence, if you mean that there has been sort of domestic violence going on for the course of the life, that's very frequent. I wouldn't know exactly what the statistics show. I'm not sure how much statistics we have on this, but there's definitely a correlation. However, there are a series of factors that can intervene and make things worse in older age. It could be degenerative illnesses. It could be substance abuse from one of the partners. So there are some factors that can make it worse. I don't know if you have any additional information on the statistics, Sandra?
Yeah, not at this point, no.
Okay.
Would anyone else like to share any thoughts or reflections before we wrap up? I actually didn't see that question in the chat. I think my chat function isn't working. Are there any other questions in there?
It was direct message. Sorry,
Right.
I just saw that now.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be any questions. Would Alessandra or Charles, would you like to share any final reflections or final words before we wrap up?
I think I just wanted to mention, sometimes it's hard to intervene a little bit in these online platforms, but feel free to reach out to us through our emails. You'll find them on our website. If you have any sort of follow-up questions, or if there's anything that comes up, or something that you wanted to ask and you didn't quite manage to during this session.
Great, thank you. Charles, would you like to say anything before we wrap up the session?
Oui, comme je vous ai dit, je suis étonné et je voudrais répondre après, hein, en consultant ce que vous avez donné tout à l'heure sur le slide. Je ne voudrais pas intervenir parce que
Great, thank you,
voudrais
Charles.
seulement,
Thanks
les
to
questions.
both presenters or both organizations for today's session. That's it from us. Thanks again to the presenters. The recording will be on our YouTube channel within a few days and we'll share it with you. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day.